The exterior of your house and the landscaping surrounding is a big factor in the first impression people form when driving by or pulling into your driveway, and most people would agree that location and curb appeal is paramount in the value of a home. After all, you can drop a pile of lumber and drywall anywhere. I influence anybody who is able to get through the chaos of my first impression. Beautiful was something that I kept really close to my heart, that I kept from a lot of people for years and years. It's my story, and I think that was the first impression I needed to give to people as a solo artist. This is who I am, this is what I'm about. My first impression when I made it through was good, because I'm going to prove to you that I deserve to be here. Because they told me that sometimes I lack confidence in my performance and sometimes I'm not as consistent as they'd like me to be. Making a strong first impression is as important as ever, especially when meeting face to face. People are inevitably disappointed, because no one's as good as Bill Clinton's first impression. Or, he's done things. He's disappointed people in a variety of ways. And so then, the fall is hard. I strongly believe that appearance is important, as it's the first impression you get, but that is definitely not the deciding factor. Never forget that you only have one opportunity to make a first impression, with investors, with customers, with PR, and with marketing. Above all, a query letter is a sales pitch and it is the single most important page an unpublished writer will ever write. It's the first impression and will either open the door or close it. It's that important, so don't mess it up. Mine took 17 drafts and 2 weeks to write. Nothing is as exciting, or as nerve-wracking, as being the new girl. Whether it's your first day of school or you're starting a dream job, if there's one thing that makes a first impression a lot less daunting, it's a really, really good hair day. When you first hear Mozart's music, your first impression is that it's very alive, but if you peel away the layers, you can hear sorrow and sadness behind it, and that's what I try to be, multi-layered. I know you only get one chance to make a first impression in a city, and I was so disappointed in myself for how that first season in New York had gone. It felt like a blown opportunity. It felt like I'd cemented my reputation in the opposite way that I'd wanted to. Selfish. Not a leader. Not a winning player. I've seen promotions rush things to market and not be strategic about it. The first impression is the lasting impression. My grandmother started as a ticket taker and basically became the CFO of my dad's company. It was a very important first impression for me. I've always looked on the business with more eyes than just as a wrestler. You could be in a room with somebody you don't realize you're in a room with, and that first impression or something that you give off might be appreciated by someone or it might not. I'm always just being mindful of you never know who's watching. A lot of critics are lazy. They don't want to look closely and analyze something for what it is. They take a quick first impression and then rush to compare it to something they've seen before. My first impression of Beverly Hills was that it had a landscape of small houses built by famous architects, so I didn't want to make a big block or sculpture here. I wanted to make a community rooted to the place. What can a first impression tell us about anyone? Why, no more than a chord can tell us about Beethoven, or a brushstroke about Botticelli. For me it's always about first impressions. I trust my instincts. I love to prepare if it's something that requires training, but I don't like to prepare the psychology too much. I enjoy the psychology of the character, but I work better from a first impression. I don't walk barefoot. When I see a girl barefoot in the street, I'm like, really? But obviously, I can't judge someone for that first impression. I think it's really important that I'm not the only model in the world that goes through personal problems. People forget that we're human. We don't get to call in sick. You have to go and put on a smile. Every single day is a first impression, so you can't have a bummed out day. Work at the same time on sky, water, branches, ground, keeping everything going on an equal basis. Don't be afraid of putting on color. Paint generously and unhesitatingly, for it is best not to lose the first impression. You use marketing to see what an audience's first impression is because that is something you can never really know yourself until you see it. I love the fact that we, as Black people, carry our faith with us. We share it and embrace it and love it and talk about it because we talk about everything else, and why not that? And that was the first impression that I had that really touched me. If people are failing, they look inept. If people are succeeding, they look strong and good and competent. That's the halo effect. Your first impression of a thing sets up your subsequent beliefs. If the company looks inept to you, you may assume everything else they do is inept. I don't really believe in genres. I don't want people to have any preconceptions about me. I want the first impression to be the music. Number 1, and I want you to emblaze this on your brain, you only have one chance to make a first impression. Everything I do in my life is very instinctual and in the moment. If I'm attracted to something, that's it. If I have reservations, those don't change till they're resolved. My first impression is how I go. We have a bad image in the world, I've got to admit. I just want people to think twice about Colombia. Don't go by the first impression. I just don't give off a great first impression. As a director, I really have to rely on my first impression because I utilize that to best tell the story. That's all the audience has. I let the scripts be my Bible. You make a first impression and people never forget it. If people want to think of me as the wacky Juno lady forever, I could think of worse ways to be labeled. When you see a person, do you just concentrate on their looks? It's just a first impression. Then there's someone who doesn't catch your eye immediately, but you talk to them and they become the most beautiful thing in the world. The greatest actors aren't what you would call beautiful sex symbols. Encore was an experiment. Encore was the second chance at a first impression. Encore was not completely planned. It sounds cliché, but if someone is willing to be themselves and not try too hard to someone they're not, that sticks. That is what makes an amazing first impression. School kids, black and white, would call me Kunta Kinte as a cuss. If ever my hair was particularly messy, if ever I looked scruffy at school, I would be called Kunta Kinte. My first impression was that it was bad to be African and bad to be associated with him. Design is how you make your first impression with your consumers. Make sure it is a lasting one. I think you only make your debut album once, and you only get that one chance to make a first impression. My belief is you have one chance to make a first impression. Walking at random through the streets, we came by chance upon the Cathedral of Notre Dame. I shall long remember my first impression of the scene within. The lofty Gothic ceiling arched far above my head and through the stained windows the light came but dimly. It was all still, solemn and religious. A band in our position, we have a first impression to make. We don't want to come out of the gate and make people sad. I think we consciously made that choice to keep it happy and up. Each time I arrived in a new city, I'd get lost in the streets and photograph everything that looked interesting, taking nearly 1,000 photographs every day. After each day of shooting, I'd select 30 or 40 of my favorite photographs and post them on Facebook. I named the albums after my first impression of each city. The first impression that I liked doing was an impression of Sherry O'Terry's Barbara Walters impression on SNL. I found that I could mimic that pretty well, and people got a kick out of that. My first impression when I heard Heaven was, do not let anyone else have that song. I'm putting it on hold. I knew it was special from the first time I heard it, and I thought my fans would love it as much as I did. Starting off, I was pretty arrogant. They handed an 18-year-old the keys to a D1 FBS contending university. I blew up a little bit, said some things I didn't mean, and that follows you. You get one chance to make a first impression. I made the wrong one. Costume, hair and makeup can tell you instantly, or at least give you a larger perception of who a character is. It's the first impression that you have of the character before they open their mouth, so it really does establish who they are. A visual always brings a first impression, but if there's going to be a first impression, I might as well use it to control the story. So why not do something like throw a mask on? You only get one chance to make the first impression, and I made the biggest first impression ever by throwing the big show over the top rope. There's not too many times you get a chance to make a second first impression. I grew up on Raffi. That was my first impression of what a rock star was. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.